What is Neofeudalism? By Morpheus Christus, it is a commonly held belief amongst right-wing critiques that socialism is a contemptuous ideology which only brings about destruction and chaos in its wake, which is understandable. After all, pretty much every totalitarian regime which claimed to be socialist has resulted in colossal failure. Whether it's frequent famines and food shortages to persecution of dissidents, it is no surprise as to why the common man, especially those who survived the Soviet Union and other regimes, would have such averse feelings towards socialism. However, there is one glaring issue which critiques and supporters of socialism have overlooked. The so-called socialist regimes of old were only socialist in name only. Let me explain. The concept of socialism originated from German-born philosopher Karl Marx via his three-part magnum opus work titled Das Kapital, which was published between the years 1867 to 1894. He details the inherent inequalities and contradictions which were ever present within industrialized societies, namely in the West. He posited that capitalism, the private ownership of the means of production, was the leading cause of the various injustices of industrial society. According to Marx, the working class would eventually rise up, overthrow the ruling elites, or bourgeois according to Marxist nomenclature, and establish a fair and just worker-owned society. This utopian vision would later come to be known as communism, and it is the class-conscious worker, or socialists, who would be responsible for catalyzing such a radical transformation. The ideas of Marx would persist well after his death, inspiring millions with a brighter, more egalitarian conception of how society should function. One notable figure who attempted to bring Marxist idealism to fruition was the Russian dictator Vladimir Lenin, whom, as some of you may already be aware of from my documentary Bolshevism Unmasked, was responsible leading the Bolshevik Revolution, which resulted in the usurpation of the Russian Tsar and brought about the world's first worker-owned republic. However, what manifested was the polar opposite of anything Marx would have conceptualized. Beyond the rhetoric and aesthetics of being communist, the Soviet Union by and large was a neo-feudalist dictatorship. Feudalism is a hierarchical system where land ownership and protection were exchanged for loyalty and service. How it worked was as follows. A central religious institution, the Catholic Church in the case of Europe, would dictate who gets to rule. The rulers then would appoint lords and nobles to own large plots of land. The people who lived on the land were known as serfs. These serfs would provide services for the nobles in exchange for land use and protection. However, it should be noted that it was impermissible for serfs to own their own land. They had to rent it from the nobles and landlords. Serfs provided a variety of essential services for their landlords in the feudal system. Primarily, they worked the land, producing crops and raising livestock to sustain the estate. Along with agricultural labor, they performed maintenance tasks like repairing roads, buildings, and fences. Serfs often paid rent in the form of produce or labor rather than money, and were obligated to give a portion of their harvest to their lord. During harvest and planting times, extra labor was required. Additionally, serfs were responsible for various duties on the manor, such as collecting firewood, brewing beer, or making tools. They also had to pay dues or taxes, often in goods, to their landlords and offer service as soldiers if need be. Feudalism would eventually dissolve and reform itself as capitalism following a myriad of social and economic changes which allowed for peasants to seek out wage labor, thus resulting in the creation of the labor market. However, the quality of working wages and labor environments were heavily dictated by the top 1% who owned the means of production, or bourgeois as Marx called them. These inadequate conditions would pave the way for the rise of Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and many other wannabe socialist revolutionaries. As explained earlier, these so-called revolutionaries were neo-feudalists. Whether these men were consciously aware of what they were doing is debatable, but it is unequivocal based on their actions that they had not only deviated from Marx's vision, but they had manipulated socialism to essentially recreate the very feudalistic oppression which the masses had hoped to do away with. When one looks at the quality of life in the Soviet Union, for instance, he would be hard-pressed to find any significant differences between it and the Tsarist regime which Lenin supposedly rebelled against. From suppression of speech to widespread famines, to the systemic abuse of worker rights and more, the Soviet Union was merely feudalism cloaked in populist rhetoric and idealism. So in short, a neo-feudalist is someone who openly espouses pro-worker and populist ideas in order to deceive the masses for his own agenda. Neo-feudalists can range from center-left to far-right on the political spectrum, but what they all have in common is that they are in it for themselves and their cronies. The working class is simply a stepping stone for them. A true socialist should be a man of the people and a champion of true democracy. Knowing these differences will be fundamental and in many instances life-saving in the struggle against international capitalism. With that said, this is Morpheus Christus, signing off.